So as Bob mentioned, we've got an hour, and Bruce and I have plenty of slides. So hopefully we'll give you some value in the next hour. And if there's some follow-up questions you have, since we are in such a compressed schedule, I think several times you'll see our email addresses and Twitter information listed out there. So you'll be able to reach us. So quickly, I am Greg Smith. I'm an Agile coach and trainer, and I've been using Agile, I guess, since 2001. And actually, I do things like this. I do user story training, but most of the time I'm actually with a customer, and we're actually doing some kind of custom Agile transformation. I'm actually in the middle of that right now, and I had to leave another Zoom call to come do this, so that they were very gracious to let me go. But anyway, that's what I do, and I help people customize Agile. And Bruce, you want to speak to yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Bruce Kottner. I'm the director for key accounts for Manpower Group. So Manpower Group, if you're not familiar, is a leading global workforce solutions company. That's a fancy word for saying that we're able to help find talent for companies, or we do a lot of managed services. I work really closely with Greg on engagements similar to something like what you're going to see today, and work really closely with the Experis IT team. So you're probably familiar with Bobby. We'll introduce her in a second, but I work really closely with that Sacramento Experis team, and they'll never tell you this, but they're one of the leading branches in our company. So they have a really great group of people to work with, lots of experience, and very professional. So I encourage you to reach out to them if you have any needs. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Bobby for her introduction.
Yeah, and maybe Bruce, before you go, you want to mention the cards?
Yes, how could I forget? So this is going to be a really good presentation by Greg. You're going to learn a lot from it, but just in case, to keep everyone engaged on this, I'm going to be passing out. You'll have a couple of opportunities to respond to a quiz. And if you respond with a winning answer, I'll make sure that we get a gift card out to you, an Amazon e-gift card. And then, Steve, what we'll do is whoever wins, I'll grab those email addresses. I'll email this out.
Yeah. So if you haven't got chat open, make sure you get your chat box open, because that's how we'll take the answers. And the first right answer that we see in chat will be the one who gets the card. And we'll be doing the first little micro quiz in probably the next 5 minutes.
Great. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Bobby.
Hey, everyone. It sure is hard to follow the gift cards, so happy to be here today. I am on the board of directors for IIBA, and I'm representing Experis. Our team is just very much behind these webinars and happy to support the IIBA team. We are actively looking for business analysts, project managers, and developers in the market. Even though, this has been an unprecedented year, we continue to help our clients find the right talent. So please reach out if you have any needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby.
Sure.
Okay, so it is just an hour, as we said. Actually, according to my watch, it's 54 minutes to go. So just so we can have a good baseline, it's really hard to just talk about one Agile practice like stories. So I'm going to kick us off with 2 or 3 minutes of just Scrum fundamentals and let you see where Bruce and I are coming from. And then we will talk about the meat of what the workshop's about today. We'll talk about user stories, how they evolve, talk about things like finding users, profiles, personas, and basically to show the evolution of the story, how it kind of goes from being like a shell to something that you can estimate to something that you can actually deliver to a production environment. So we're going to walk through that in the next 53 minutes, it looks like. So hopefully everyone has access to the chat box. If you don't, you might want to open it up real quick. So Bruce, you want to take our first question, our first quiz of the day?
Sure. So quiz number 1, we're going to talk about user stories. User stories were first defined by A, the Scrum Guide, B, the PMBOK, C, the BABOK, D, Jacobson's use case model, or E, extreme programming. So looking for the first correct answer on that. And it looks like we do have a winner. Looks like Bob is the winner on this. So it is the correct answer is E, extreme programming. So congratulations to Bob.
Yeah, good job, Bob. It looks like maybe a little background too before we get on into the presentation. The concept of user stories was defined by Kent Beck, and he was one of the people who got extreme programming going. And he first defined it in 1998. And he was inspired by Jacobson, or somebody say Jacobson's use case model. But the first real kind of defining moment where it was defined and somebody used that term user story was 1998 in extreme programming and Kent Beck. So good job, Bob. All right. And as I mentioned too, I'm sure you guys know this, when you train on Agile, to just talk about one practice and not talk about it in context is dangerous. So I do just want to talk lightly about the Scrum model. I'm going to kind of iterate a story through today. So let me see if I can get my drawing tool going here. Yeah. So we'll see if your Scrum's my Scrum, and I'll watch in the chat box to see if there's any disconnects. I'll probably guess 80–90% of you are using Scrum today, or you've been trained on it. Most business analysts I meet have nowadays. So Scrum starts with user stories really being defined pretty lightly in something we call a product backlog. And a product owner owns this backlog and works with the team to create it. And you can see I've got like little stories in here. The product owner will go through it with the team and they'll actually prioritize. And you can see I've got this product owner said some are critical, some are high, some are medium or low. Team will come back and actually estimate the stories, t-shirt sizing, some people call it, using Fibonacci sequence and story pointing. So we'll do this at the product backlog level. And then we'll actually say what subset of these stories do we think we complete in a little miniature project, or what a lot of people call as a sprint or iteration. So we'll just say this whole box I've got down here, we'll say this is like a 2-week iteration or sprint. The team will guess about how much they can fit in based on how many story points they've averaged or their velocity. And then usually they'll do like a half day of planning, maybe a little less, whatever, but actually to add details to all these stories, to actually add acceptance criteria, figure out how we're going to test them. Developers will actually have to define their tasks. And even though I've got a whole box here, this whole thing usually takes about a half a day. And then the bulk of the work, like in a 10-day, 2-week sprint, about 9 days are spent here actually construction testing, getting the product owner to accept. And then at the end of the sprint, we might have like another half day where we do a demo, a retrospective, get feedback and so on, talk about stories that were discovered. And then we actually see what stories actually now went into the backlog that we discovered. And we actually see, has the product owner changed their mind about these priorities? Maybe some things have went up, some things have went down. And we'll go through the whole exercise again and say, okay, in the next 2 weeks, what do we think we can do this now in the current dynamic updated backlog, and go through the same thing. And we'll start with stories that are maybe even pointed, but then we'll enrich them. And then we actually take them into the construction and testing part of the sprint. We'll have all the details that we can think of so developers and testers can bring them home. So I'm looking quickly in the chat box to see if we've got any disconnect from my flow here on Scrum. But it looks like I'm seeing some questions, but not related to Scrum. And we will stop at moments going through the presentation today and take questions too. So feel free to put those in to chat. But it looks like my Scrum is your Scrum. So I'm going to get on down the road. Okay, so Bruce and I have actually had a fun time actually preparing for this workshop. And my first job with the software development team was as a business analyst, working at a company called 4Gen Software in Seattle many, many years ago. And I remember we did a lot of contracts. Like one of our contracts was with General Electric. And General Electric didn't really talk to us in terms of use cases or stories. They actually brought what you see here in front of you. They actually brought legal requirements, if you will. So almost like making sure you meet your commitments. So our lawyers both agree. Your lawyer said you delivered, my lawyer says you delivered, and then I'll pay you. So I'm very familiar with these. And Bruce, I'm betting in your world, since you do like a lot of contract work, you're probably familiar with these kind of requirements also.
Yeah, and in my world, we do a lot of times, we'll negotiate contracts. And of course, ideally you would love to have, be close to an agreement already to where you just do one pass and, you maybe make a couple of minor adjustments, contracts executed, but rarely does that happen. And it's usually a process, becomes a contract volley with each side doing their best to cover their risk. So it ends up being a very long process.
So it's a lot of CYA, right? It's like, it's not so much worried about delivering value. It's really kind of focused on just legally I met the requirements, whether your users use that software or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm guessing a lot of you, and you can type in the chat box too, but I'm guessing a lot of you maybe have to deal with system shall, system will, system must, users will kind of requirements today. And as a generalization, I'd say they're not good. They may be good for lawyers, but for us in the agile space who are trying to make customers and users happy, it's more to make lawyers happy than users. So as time's progressed, a lot of us have been lucky. Like I said, my first business analyst job, my company did do use cases, and I love them. I still love use case structure and format today. I've got an example of one here on the left. And it's really nice. I mean, it actually says who's the user, and they actually use the term actor instead of user in use cases, and it talks about the steps, and it talks about, if you will, the value that they're going to get when this thing's over, and like kind of shows post conditions. And when I learned to be a business analyst, you would often like do diagrams like this too, to try to show the whole system, all the places a user could go, and where maybe a use case extended or included another use case. And it really helped you have a good overall perspective of a user's experience in the application or service you were building. So I'm a big fan of use cases. But something I learned even as my first job as a business analyst was use cases get very detailed. And to me, they almost start leaning toward design instead of what I'm guessing most of you need to do at the start of your projects or your releases is first I want to scope it, and then maybe I want to prioritize it, and to actually jump into all the details about what it'll look like when you'll implement it. An agile and lean team might say that's a form of waste. Because if I actually do detailed use cases for every requirement, and then once we prioritize, we decide to kill half of them, all that detailed analysis work was throwaway. So I love the use case concept, especially once we get closer to going into a sprint, because it does make business rules explicit and testable. But doing it at the start of a project, I don't think it's a good idea. I think they're too rich too early. And like I said, I want us to be more focused on why than what. And a lot of times use case really will get people thinking about designs and screens. And I don't think it's valuable to go there at the start when we're just envisioning where we want to go and having conversations with our customers and product owners. So love them closer to the sprint, but at the start of a project, not a big fan. So instead, a lot of us are doing user stories now, and this is the typical syntax I'm guessing that you all use, those of you who do user stories today. And it's pretty simple. Like a use case would say, like actor does this. Instead, we just say when we talk about a role or a user. And a use case would say all the things a person's wanting to do, the actor wants to do. But where a story, I think, is better than a use case is a story says, why do they want to do it? So I want to review seller feedback. That would be the end of it in a use case. But in a user story, it's like, so I can see if I trust this seller. And if you as a business analyst or your development team sees that why part, we might say, oh, you just want to see if you can trust the seller? Well, did you know you can do that in 3 or 4 other places in the app today? So by putting that why part in the need, it really helps us kind of cut to the chase. And sometimes it'll make it crisper for us what we need to design and build. It also might tell us we already have that functionality if that's what you're trying to do. So I'm guessing folks using stories, you're following the syntax today, and I don't see any comments in the chat, so I'm going to assume this is pretty much what folks are using. And we'll be building on this the rest of the workshop. Okay. So a quick, I guess, preview of where we're going the rest of the workshop is look at a story being really light, almost like we had on the previous page. User, what they want to do, and why. And for me, that's usually enough for the first phase of a release or project, which is scoping and prioritizing the work. And then once we get a backlog scoped and prioritized, then we actually want to understand how big is it. So then we need to usually have a deeper discussion on the stories so the team understands them well enough to at least say it's bigger than a bread box, it's smaller than this. So they can do what I call t-shirt sizing or do story pointing, use the Fibonacci sequence to say it's an extra small, small, medium, large, extra large story. And then we can start doing some forecasting and long-term planning with the stories. And then lastly, we actually get a story to where it's much closer to the use cases I showed you, where we actually have everything that the developers need to design it and build it, user experience, so your front-end developers know what the screen needs to look like. We have crisp acceptance criteria that the testers can write test cases for. There shouldn't be anything missing. So we eventually get to richer levels, but we start at this kind of orange level I've got at the top, and then get a little richer in the purple, and then a little, actually ultimate, the final level of detail in the green I've got here. And maybe to give you a visual on that, if we go back to my diagram earlier of how I kind of use Scrum, I think of that first level is at the top when the backlog's created. So just enough to scope it, research it, prioritize it. So I don't even use the full user story syntax at this level. I usually have the teams I work with do sticky notes, and they literally will just have a sticky note that just says seller can sell, administrator can delete, buyer can ask questions. And if those stories actually survive the first level of prioritization, then we'll make them more formal and we'll add why so that I can syntax it. So initially, we just want enough to prioritize and to find the minimum viable product, which we'll be talking about in a few more minutes. And then for the stories that go to the top, then we will, like I said, convert them into the nice syntax. We'll start talking about technical risk. We'll talk about dependencies. We'll talk to the development team, and we'll get all kinds of notes around this thing. We'll actually start getting crisper on what it is. And once we feel we're pretty crisp on the scope and what we're trying to accomplish within a story, we'll have the team estimate, like I'm showing here. See if I can bring it up. Yeah, so we'll have them do t-shirt sizing or story pointing once they actually know more details and we've had a nice discussion. And we won't ask them for, like, this is a commitment. When you say 8 points, we'll just say, so we can do long-term planning and kind of forecast what's going in the next sprint. Can you kind of give us, like, is this a high, medium, low, large, or extra large, or so on? So we'll do that level next. And then ultimately, and I'll be showing this in a few more diagrams later, the story becomes the ultimate level of detail. We've got all these different acceptance scenarios. We've got the construction tasks. We know how we're going to test it. It's a super rich story. And now it's actually good enough to go into my purple box here for construction and testing. Okay, so I'm going to continue on, and I'm watching the chat box too to see if you have any questions. And in general, kind of a summary here of why I like stories over use cases is stories are so wide. They let us do all these things. So we can plan at different levels, we can estimate, we can prioritize, we can have a conversation with the customer in the language that they use. We got a way to actually test them with acceptance scenarios, and a lot of you are probably familiar with the Gherkin language and using like given, when, and thens for testing. And then we can actually tie stories to test cases. So stories to me are like the ultimate artifact in an agile environment. We can do it all. So why I'm in love with stories.
Hey, Greg?
Yeah.
If you can go back one second there, just a question. You know, one thing that sticks out to me here is no, next slide. I'm sorry.
On this slide?
No, keep going forward.
Oh, sorry.
One more. One more forward. There you go.
Oh, sorry.
So that one on the right, it says, how can I document requirements in a format that the business understands? That one really speaks to me because we see that all the time where when we're working with a decision maker, we want to make sure that they understand that language, especially when it involves IT in the business. If you don't do that effectively, then you'll either get a no response or you'll get a no because they don't understand it. Because we sometimes we as people don't want to admit we don't understand that. So how would you, as a business analyst, be able to check for that understanding to make sure that they do understand what you're trying to project?
Sure. Well, a lot of times if we use that syntax that we were looking at, like if I look at this example, it's not usually our language, it's usually theirs. So they actually would say to us, my sellers need to be able to sell, my retailers need to be able to advertise. So it's not so much that we have to make sure, it's almost like user stories fit natural English language. Whereas, if we actually go back just for a second to your point, if we look at these stories, and if I go back to my use cases, which is the first tool that I used as a business analyst, my use case is like if I sit down with a business person who doesn't work with IT teams very often, and I say, tell me who your actors are and what the preconditions and steps and post-conditions, they're going to be, what do you mean precondition steps, post-conditions? Software development teams and business analysts, we're kind of used to this because we're thinking about testing and crisp business rules, but they don't. So naturally though, the syntax of stories just maps the way people naturally speak. They don't have to change anything. And I'm even showing like a syntax here, but a lot of times we'll just ask them for a scenario, just have them write down like a paragraph, tell us what they're envisioning. So it doesn't even have to be this structured. So it is meant to be able to speak directly to customers who are non-technical in their language, as we say.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So actually leads us, Bruce, to you needing to pull some more money out of your pocket. So everybody get your chat box up. And this will be a subjective answer, so it's not a perfect answer. But here's quiz number 2. So get your chat box ready to answer. And go ahead, Bruce, take it.
So the question is, which of the following is not a typical characteristic of a user story? Choices are A, user need, B, an interface design, C, a token for later conversation, or D, a user task.
I think we put in too easy of a question, Bruce. That one got answered pretty quickly.
Yes, it looks like Heather Coda is the winner. So congratulations, Heather.
All right,
way to
Heather.
go.
Good job. Yes.
And pretty much everyone else.
Next go around, we'll get deeper. Okay, so I've talked very high level conceptually so far. Let's pretend, and actually this is probably somewhat of a reality for all of us. Let's pretend Bruce and I are like, we're busy today. We're just going to create an application for you guys that's sitting out there, and you guys run your own workshop today, and you learn about user stories on your own. So let's pretend there's no interactive facilitator. Bruce isn't here. We're like busy, and maybe, I don't know, Bruce and I are going to create this app and try to sell it to people. I don't know, but if you look at the bottom of the screen, we're going to create a user story education system. So we're going to talk about if Bruce and I and a development team sit down, maybe Bruce and I are the business analysts, how would we actually go about taking this presentation and converting it to a self-driven application where you can learn on your own about user stories. So that's where we're going to go for the rest of the presentation. And I'm guessing maybe half of you look like this today. If you're like my wife, she's actually wearing all these dress clothes when I actually go into her office now when we're all home. But then she's got like sweatpants and PJs on for the rest of the way down where her camera can't pick her up. So, okay. So this is actually interesting. This is a use case diagram, and I use it to train people on user stories. So even though it's a use case diagram, you might call these people out here actors. You know, if we use the kind of nice syntax that formal use case uses, but they're really users too. So the very first place I would want to start any agile project is, who are these stick people? Who are we actually building it for? Who are the users? So to me, that's the very first thing an agile project starts with. I'm guessing you guys are business analysts. I bet you do a lot of work in this space today of actually identifying users. You're probably doing personas, profiles, things like that. Maybe like research on users. So I don't know, obviously, all of you on the call, and I think we have a huge group today, but some synonyms that aren't perfect fits for user, but they're good enough. Like if you do use cases, you can say, instead of user, you can say actor. When I work with like admins for systems, they always say to me, do you mean a role and like permissions? I'm like, sure, you can say a role. And if you're a person in marketing or user experience, you're probably very versed in the term persona. You could say that's a user, or even a lighter version of a persona as a profile. And audience is probably a little bigger than a user. It's probably like several users, and a demographic probably is too. But if you want to use that term, it doesn't bother me. But I just wanted to bring these up today for anybody on the call who's new to user stories, or if you're struggling working with like business folks who use these terms, it's okay, don't sweat it. You don't have to make them say user. If they use these terms, we can just take care of it on our side.
Hey, Greg, I'm just wondering, would customer be on that list, or does that fit?
You know, a customer could be a user. And actually, I'm guessing for a lot of the folks on this workshop today, their customer might be the product owner. So the product owner might be telling them, this is what these various users need. So indirectly, I don't know that I would say customer is like the direct user, but they might actually have a bunch of users that they want us to take care of. So like, even if we're doing a contract, you actually might have a customer that you signed, you know, like Experis, I don't know, maybe you sign a contract with Amazon, and Amazon's a customer, but they actually want to take care of maybe you and me when we're in our shopping carts and shopping around. So when we take care of the users, the customers should be happy, but it's more like that higher level customer is trying to represent users, but they're not typically the end user.
Got it.
Okay, so hopefully that helps.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question. So if we continue, Bruce and I, maybe we go out and we do a little research, and we actually get the email addresses of all you guys that are attending today, and we come back and we know we're going to be users of this kind of self-driven system. Even if we're not in there when you train yourselves, we might come back later and want reports and all kinds of things. So I don't know, today out there, probably a project manager or two. I'm quite sure there's business analysts out there today, and there might just be your generic kind of student out there that's nothing today, like that's working on their career and they really haven't started. So we got that, and then you got Bruce as a director, you got me looking like giving myself the user role of the instructor. So that's where we want to start. And when we identify those people, I'm sure you guys as business analysts probably go out and profile them some, like you want to get a deeper understanding before you start jumping to stories and trying to guess what these people would want to do in a user story workshop application. So if you already know the users you're working with today, like you always keep delivering maybe to an internal audience, you probably have these, or you don't need to do this, you're really dialed in. But if you're doing a project for a brand new user, I'd say you don't have to get as formal as my slide, but I'd go to a whiteboard or an online tool like Miro or Mural, and I would brainstorm with the team for us to start getting empathy and understanding who this user is before we start trying to specify the functionality that we're going to create for them in the application we're building. So personas or profiles, I don't care how you do it, but you should definitely understand who your users are before we take a leap to saying, okay, I think this is what they want the system to do. And it's obviously, depending on what you guys are doing, much more complicated than this. Remember, research could last weeks or months. It could be, like I said, you already know the user and you just jump right in. So various levels of work here. Okay, and then we would literally do an exercise like this. I use an exercise called story mapping. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't usually ask the teams I work with to write formal user stories. Since we think some of these, or a good portion, might be thrown away once the product owner looks through this box in the backlog later, and when I train a team, I just say in the sticky notes, even electronic sticky notes, if we're doing this with an online tool, name the user, the action or the verb they want to do, the noun they want to do it to. So I don't have to say, as a PM, I want to learn how to estimate user stories so I can further my career. For now, we can leave the why part out. And I just start very high level like this and have the team just kind of brainstorm, no filtering from the product owner or anybody. We all just kind of brainstorm and think of every possible story that these users could want in the potential scope. So actually, maybe I'm gonna look in the chat box real quick. And if you do story mapping today, or you do an exercise like this, if you could type yes or no in the chat box so I can get a feel for what the audience looks like today. So yes or no, if you sort of do this workshop, is your team to actually say, here's the users and here's all of the things that they might want to do. Okay, it's looking like most people don't do story mapping today. So actually, I'll go a little deeper into it here in the next few minutes then. So I would use sticky notes or an online tool. And what we're trying to do after we get done with this exercise is we'll work with the product owner and they'll prioritize the backlog. And I'm guessing most of you have heard this term, minimum viable product, or MVP. And once we get these list of stories, we'll ask the product owner to work with the team and we'll say, what's the minimum functionality in these stories that we could deploy and start getting feedback from our users or getting value to the users. And like I said, that term's MVP, or minimum viable product. So we're gonna take all those sticky notes that we created back here, and then we're gonna put them on a wall and actually start sorting them. And I think in the next slide, I've got this. So now we've actually got, maybe Bruce and I did this. And when Bruce and I did the story mapping exercise, we came back and we said, you know, it looks like there's several categories of stories. So there's a bunch related to registration. There's a bunch related to story writing. There's all these like different categories. So once we had all these sticky notes, Bruce and I would like try to ID like natural categorization of the stories. And then we would actually forget about connecting them to users, and we would just put them in their own silo and say, here's a bunch of stories related to user registration. Here's a bunch of stories where people want to learn about estimating them. Here's a bunch of stories related to testing and so on. So Bruce and I would do that. And then let's just say Bruce is playing product owner. He and I would discuss each story and we would say, could we do any kind of release to users without that story in it? So Bruce and I would go through and we would say, in the register students category, could we go live without that notification story? And let's just say Bruce says, yeah, I could go live with that. I'm like, okay, we don't need it. Bruce, could we go live without customizing my view? Yeah, I don't have to have that. What about updating their account? Bruce is like, that's a tough one. And I said, well, what if we say they can call in and our webmaster will update it for them? He's like, okay, that's a workaround for now. And I'll say, what about creating an account? And Bruce is like, well, you can't do anything without an account, so got to have that. So that'll be above the line. And also I want them to have the ability to delete an account. So in that category, the minimum viable stories are these two. Bruce is saying, I got to have these. And Bruce and I will do that for every category. And eventually you'll get what we've got here. We've got the minimum viable product here at the top. And that's what we'll put into our first sprints. And I should say too, a lot of people will say, oh, so the first sprint equals MVP. The team hasn't estimated the work yet. So we don't know how long it's going to take. All we know is our first release will have to have this. So no matter how many sprints it takes, Bruce doesn't want us to put it in production and give it to users till we at least have this level of functionality. Then he might support doing a deployment. So I'm looking in the chat box too real quick to see if folks have any questions on this. But yeah, and if I look at my deck here, this is actually what the team in Seattle last year I was working with. And they did this exercise we're talking about. And you can kind of see it here. Hopefully my screen is big enough for you, but they identified the users, and then they went through and created this backlog down here of sticky notes. And then they came back and started categorizing them. And right now you're actually looking at them. They're going through them one by one. And eventually they're going to put a piece of tape here and they're going to start saying, okay, here's the MVP stories at the top. So this team was actually doing it, but I hate to say this, but I actually call it old school now, circa 2019, pre-COVID. So this is what we all used to do. I'm actually hoping someday we get back there, because this is a digression, but agile people like me believe the best tools are low tech and high touch. And they are. I mean, I've been working nonstop with teams now for 3 months, totally remote, and we're getting stuff done with this exercise, much more collaborative. I actually see more ideas come out. But for now, we can still do this. And actually, I recently did like a public workshop a couple of months ago for the Puget Sound Project Management Institute. And we did story mapping online in this tool called Miro, as you can see here that I've got. So it actually will let you do a lot of stuff for free. So I just got a free download, and we actually came up with our categories up here that you can see once we actually did the brainstorming for all the stories. And then we started putting the stories in categories. And in the workshop, we actually started defining what the MVP was. We actually started saying, okay, within registration, I can go live without instructor FAQs. I can go live without this, but I gotta have registration confirmation. I gotta have instructor being able to invoice. I gotta be able to have to register within this category. And then we just did every other category too, till we finally got, as you can kind of see here, the circled MVP. So tons of tools out there, Miro, Mural. Heck, you could just like, somebody could bring up, they could share their screen, you could do it in Word or PowerPoint, drag stories around, but there's tons of tools out there. But this is a light level of detail, and it's all we need when we're just trying to say what's gonna be in a release and what's the priority. Okay, so now once we do have a prioritized backlog, we've actually got to figure out how to estimate it. How big is it? And will it fit into a sprint with other stories? So we want to do some light scheduling, figure out how many stories are going to go into the next sprint. Maybe you could even forecast 2 or 3 sprints out. And I'm guessing a lot of you do story points and planning poker today. So that's where we want to go next. And we'll actually have a meeting for like the top stories, maybe the top 10 or 20 stories in the backlog, and we'll discuss them with the product owner. And we already know if it's at the top, we know it's a critical story. We'll ask the team if they've done this kind of story before. Do they have the technical knowledge, or is it brand new technology? And we'll actually kind of assign risk to that. Low risk means the team's done it before, or the technology's commodity. High risk might be, wow, that's going to require me to learn Ruby or something we haven't done here. And then we'll talk about dependencies. And then we'll just have, typically a business analyst like yourselves or a scrum master leading the conversation. We'll start just having general discussion about what this thing is, if there's any business rules that we know of already, anything that kind of spills out. And then once we're done, we'll actually have the team do planning poker. And Bruce and I were talking, we could probably do planning poker as its own little webinar someday. But in the old days, and I'm guessing a lot of you do this, and maybe I'll actually kind of look in the chat here. If you've done planning poker before, like I've got these gentlemen in this picture, like you kind of pick a size and you vote. Can you put that in the chat box for me? So either you've done it or you're familiar with planning poker and story point estimation. If you could type yes or no in the chat right now. Oh, good. So far looks about half, Bruce. Maybe
yeah,
2.
about half and half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe 60%. So as I said, we could easily do this, a workshop just on this, but in simplest terms, we use something called relative estimation. And we usually have, like a guide, if you will, to the side here that says what we consider a small, a large, extra large, or so on. And we typically use the numbers I've got here. We usually do like the 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. And you can get more detail than this if you want to. But we usually use this, and we literally are like comparing stories when we do planning poker. So in this example, this module testing story, if it's a 5, then it probably takes 2.5 times as long for the team to deliver it as this small registration story. And gosh, I got like an 8 here, this extra large. So this is probably 4 times as long for the team to deliver as this story up here, which is a 2. So that's all we're doing. It's really just, it's relative estimation. It's not trying to get into hours or tasks. It's just comparing one story to another to say, how big are you? Like I often make the joke to folks when I train that my neighbor actually works at Microsoft, and he's a high-level executive, and he pulls in every night in a nice Porsche 911 beside my house, beside my 2004 Rusting Explorer in the driveway. And when he pulls in, I can't think of how much money he makes. I can never guess, but I know relative to me, it's more, probably 3x more than me. So That's all we're doing here. It's just a comparison. We're not trying to get exact. We only do this for long-term planning and projecting. When a team gets to a sprint, they actually do get down to the hour and personal schedules. But for long-term planning, just to say what might fit into a sprint, we do this and we do planning poker.
Hey, Greg, just a
Yes.
question on that last one there.
Yeah.
Is this, with what we talked about recently, about risk and project risk and a lot, specifically to the project that I talked to you about, would this play into that? Is that something that could be used for, assigning risk? Because everybody has their own perspective of what the risk is to the project, depending on where they work in the company. And so they could be not knowing it, but they could be a little bit more biased to risks that impact their business unit. Is that something you would use this for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if I go back for a second, Bruce, that's why I've even got this category on here where it says, when we're talking to the development team, how much risk do you see with this story? So we actually want them, at least the teams I work with, we have them quantify that. And building on your point, what I'll actually see is if I work with a team and let's just say module testing, the team says, wow, we have no idea how we're going to do this. They won't typically estimate for me. They will probably say, I've got to do more research, or they'll do that. They'll actually do this on me. They'll put the infinity symbol on it. But I will actually see if the risk is high. We actually might say we've got some more homework to do on this story before we can even do high-level estimation. So your point's really good. I actually, if a story has a ton of risk and uncertainty, we're not sure how, estimating it really is of no value. Let's just go do more research until we actually can come back and do at least a high-level order of magnitude estimate. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. I like this approach, maybe even a little bit better than a more formalized, risk assessment. I think this is a little bit easier to digest for people too, this process.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the good things. Agile sort of has risk management built into it. I would even say it's a synonym for it would be a risk-averse project management methodology. It's value-focused and trying to expose and quantify and eliminate risk as soon as possible.
Cool.
Yeah, great question. So as I mentioned, a lot of you, I saw maybe about 2/3 of you are familiar with planning poker. And all we would do is we would actually take a story like I've got back here, like the contact student story, and we would actually have the product owner describe it to the team, anybody who's going to code it, test it, work on it during the sprint. And once the product owner was done describing it, then the team would all have cards with 1, 2, 3, 5, or 8 on it. And you can see that in my next slide here. They've actually all got the cards. The product owner is describing it. They hide them from each other. And then a scrum master will often facilitate this and say vote, and everybody will hold up how big they think it is. And then because they all do it without talking to each other, you'll see 8s go up at the same time 1s go up. And somebody will say, why do you think it's so big? And you'll say, why do you think it's so little? They'll have a conversation, and then we'll secretly vote again, and we'll start seeing if the estimates start coming together. This way we actually get the whole team to share their thoughts, and we probably get the best estimate we can without actually going into a detailed design. So planning poker is good for first level estimation, just for saying what's going to fit into sprints. And Bruce and I were talking, and I see people do this exercise now, and they'll get cards still, and the scrum master will facilitate it, and they'll be on Zoom, and they'll actually kind of hold their card up, and the scrum master's got to be looking at everybody and trying to record the numbers. And there's you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But Bruce and I found this tool that's free. You don't even have to register, and it's called Voting Poker. And Voting Poker actually lets you totally do the same thing. Matter of fact, I'm going to see if I can go in right now. And Bruce and I, if I can move some stuff around here, we're gonna go into the Voting Poker app. So I'm going to put my name in. Didn't have to register. Just wants to know what my name is for voting purposes. And it looks like Bruce maybe has put himself in as Jay-Z, or maybe somebody else is arriving. Let's see.
That's me.
Is that you, Jay-Z?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to say I'm the moderator. And I'm actually going to say, if I had all the team on Zoom, I'd say, okay, team, secretly choose your number now. So I'm going to start the voting. So Bruce, I can't see your screen, so secretly vote. I can see you just went green, so your vote must be in. And I'm going to say maybe the story was contact the student or contact the teacher. So you put your estimate in, Jay-Z, and I'm going to put mine in. I'm going to say That sounds pretty easy to me. I'm going to call it a extra small or small. I'm going to call it a smaller 2. And that's my vote. Now I'm going to stop the voting. And you can actually see what happened here. It would record all the votes or scores from every team member. And you can see I did a 2, and Jay-Z, Bruce did a 5. And we'd have a discussion right now. And I'd say, you know, I think contacting a student's really easy. Jay-Z, why do you think it's hard? And go ahead, Bruce, tell me, why do you think it's harder than, you think it's twice as hard as I do? What do you think it would be hard for the team to deliver it?
Because kids are hard to talk to. I don't know.
Okay, that sounds like a good reason. And I'd say, okay, so let's vote on it again. So we both shared information with each other. And I'm gonna start the voting. And now I'm gonna think to myself, well, Bruce is right. It actually might be a little harder. So I'm gonna go from a small to a medium. And then, so we both got our votes in, and now we'll vote again. And we'll see how it went. And looks like Bruce and I got synchronized here after we shared ideas with each other. So this is a perfect world example. Can't really teach you planning poker today this quickly, but if your team is doing this, it's free. I've been using it with tons of teams. All you have to do is email the URL to a team member once you get in, and then everybody can jump in, and it's a great free way to do planning poker. Right, let me put this away and get us back to the deck. Sorry, got too many things running right now. It says I'm sharing. Do you see my screen right now, Bruce? Are you there, Bruce?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you see my PowerPoint yet?
No, we're looking at your desktop.
Okay, we're getting there. I'll get it back here in a second. There we go. I think I got it. All right. Good. Too many things on my screen. Okay, so there's voting poker. There's the URL. Highly suggest you use it. Okay. And as I mentioned too, we actually use the story points, not to say what the team's ultimately going to agree to for going into the sprint, but just for saying who gets to go to sprint planning. So if the team averaged 13 points a sprint, we'd say there's 2, there's 5, there's 13. You top 3 stories get to go to sprint planning, and then you get broke down further. And then once the team's broken down into detail, then they'll make the call what really fits and can actually go into the sprint. So we have 2 levels of estimation with stories. So first, high level, just good enough to say who goes to sprint planning. And then ultimately, after the team breaks it down in detail, what can they commit to and actually put in the sprint? And getting ready for a sprint, a lot of you probably are familiar, I'm sure, mostly business analysts, you know the term grooming or refinement. And in refinement is where we'll do a ton of the work. We will actually go from, wow, I wonder if we're going to do it, to we are. So we will write detailed acceptance scenarios. And this really is almost the equivalent of use cases I talked about at the start. Instead of precondition steps and post conditions, we have given, when, then. We'll do mock-ups and screen designs. We'll do flow diagrams. And there are tons of tools you were probably already using, and the teams I'm working with still are, like Figma, Sketch, Myra, Mural, tons of tools out there. So I don't see business analysts work changing too much here. We're probably still in some tool that you're using, maybe even Azure DevOps or Jira. You may store some of this stuff, but we have to get it rich enough so it can be tested and coded now. So we're not talking at a high level now. We want all the level of detail. And like this is an example, again, just of a super detailed story ready to go into a sprint. So a lot of times too, like this epic level I've got to the left, that's close to that category that Bruce and I were using at the top to, like, say, categories of stories. So epic is close to that, but it's usually a big story, which means it's got several underneath it. It's more like a user activity than it is a specific interaction with the system. Okay, we've actually got through and we can take some questions, which is great. So quick review, stories can be used throughout the project lifecycle, but I highly suggest you do the method that we just showed, like only add detail as you need to. Take a lean approach and don't add acceptance criteria on day one. The product owner might kill it. As Bruce pointed out, stories actually speak in natural language for our product owners and customers. Also, as I just mentioned, they really help us avoid waste. Great for prioritization. And it's not a perfect analogy, but a guy named Jeff Patton, who taught it, I think a lot of us how to do story mapping. Jeff Patton equates a user story often to being a user task. So not a perfect analogy, but close. Okay, so I'm gonna hop over to the chat box, or maybe I'll have you take a look, Bruce, and we can take questions.
Yeah, let's, there's some questions from the beginning. Greg, you want to start up there?
Sure.
And the first question was, some practitioners say that user stories are not very helpful. They're like, quote, need for fast horses. Some experts recommend to use job stories, jobs to be done, from Clayton Christensen. What do you think about it?
You know, I'm mixed. I've seen a lot of people like Mike Cohn suggesting job stories. I find that I'm taking the natural kind of user-focused stories and supplementing them with job stories and in the backlogs of teams that I work with. So, you know, everything's kind of relative to your own experiences. I mean, in the last 5 years, I probably worked with 100 teams. I can't think of anywhere I've been where stories weren't helpful. I think where they weren't helpful in the past is when we didn't have like acceptance criteria in the Gherkin language and we couldn't make them testable and we pretended they were. So I still see a ton of value in stories. And I do see value in doing job stories. I see them both as being valuable.
Next question, this is from David Dixon, and it goes back to the slide where we were covering the MVP, and it said, the question was, what are the silo titles called in this process?
Yeah, so if you brought up a formal user story kind of structure, and I won't hop to the slide, but we often will see that first level that I didn't even have on my screen, but the very top level, we usually call it an activity. And then the next level down, which you and I were working at, Bruce, the next level down, we usually actually call that the task level, because it's not usually one unique story. And then the next level down from that is the actual story. So you and I were the kind of the equivalent of an epic would be what we were calling a task, and then we'd have stories underneath that. So very high level, that's how you could look at it. We were actually, I didn't talk about this level, but we were actually that high level, the top category level, Jeff Patton would call it a task level, user task level.
Next question is from Jill. And again, it's related to MVP. How often do you find that the MVP stays at MVP, truly MVP, and doesn't end up better than the minimal viable product?
I'm working with a team right now that I just left, and their legacy is they create a backlog and 99% of it gets marked as MVP. So most people are not good at it. It requires good training with product owners. And it really helps too if you're in an environment where you need to get feedback fast, or your customer has a fire and you need to help them put a fire out fast. So the more urgent your environment is, or the more competitive it is with like competitors, then I see much better support for true essential functionality only. But if you're in a commodity world, or if you're in a monopoly, you'll struggle to get the people in your team to actually, even your product owner, to support it. But if it's urgent, which Agile is great for, most people will truly start having a conversation about what is essential. That's a good question.
And a question from Eleanor Jordan. And the question was, is it a must to have supporting documents, for example, process workflows, context diagrams, to accompany user stories? This is
Sure.
related to an enhancement to an existing system.
Sure. So Eleanor, what I do is most teams I work with will do a team agreement, and they'll say, at a minimum, we need these things to code and test a story. And maybe that's just like, they'll say, I need the story and the acceptance criteria, and that's it. And what we'll do in the refinement meeting, like 4 or 5 days before the sprint starts, we'll preview the story to developers and testers and UI design and say, these are the artifacts that I plan on bringing to sprint planning in 5 days. Is that enough? And then we treat them as business analysts. We treat the development team as a customer. And if they say, oh, I do need like a mock-up or a wireframe or a flow diagram, then we'll build it. But if they say, I don't need it, then we won't. So I see business analysts treating the team as like the customer once we get to the sprint and saying, I'm trying to help you deliver this to the customer. What do you need from me and the product owner to be able to bring it home? So that's how I kind of see it working.
Cool. And I think that's it for the questions. I do want to do one more prize because I need to do that. I need to give away some money. So this one should be fair for everyone to answer. It might take you maybe a minute to answer it, but the question is, what is the state bird of California?
Oh my. I'm watching the chat box. I have no idea what the answer is. Ooh, this is good. I hope you know the answer, Bruce.
Oh, yep. I think we got an answer. We got a lot of good ones. I did think it was the condor, but I was wrong. It's actually, and thanks for everyone for participating. It was actually the quail, the California quail. So Chris M, I will get your email address from Steve at the end of this and get a $10 Amazon card out to you. So thank you, everybody.
Oh, great. So I think we're shutting down. So folks, you got our contact info here. If you want to have questions afterwards, just ping us and hopefully we can help you out. And hope you got some value from it. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.